This presentation will be dealing with how the pastor and lay leader can become effective counselors. We will be discussing the actual techniques and skills that you can use in order to be effective in your relationship with your counselee. Now, before I proceed to discuss these techniques and skills, I'll be showing at this point a graphic which reviews what we discussed in another presentation, that is the various stages and steps in the counseling process. So this is just to remind you of the steps, and you can look at that for a few seconds. Now, let us move on to the skills. During exploration and ventilation, the purpose is to help the client and yourself understand what is happening in terms of his or her problem. Now, for this exploration and ventilation, which aids understanding, to take place, one has to use certain skills in order to facilitate this process. Now, the first of these skills involves listening. This is extremely important, listening. This is the foremost duty of the counselor. If you remember, in the other presentation on the steps in counseling, I had stressed that the counselor is not to give advice or to preach at the counselee. I'm now saying his main job is to listen. Now, listening then will help us to understand the problems, and then we can go on to talk about with the client how these problems can be solved. But listening involves specific skills, specific approaches. Now, the first activity in listening is attending. In other words, giving the client your full attention. And this is done through your eye contact with the client. It is done by your posture, sitting forward, and also you give your attention by avoiding being distracted with various other things that you might be doing, such as looking at papers, talking to someone else, etc. Now, in this role play, we will show you how one should attend to his counselee.
Tell me, Mrs. Sims, what is a single girl supposed to do when she's searching for the right mate? It's like I meet young men, but they're never Christians. I know that I should be dating a Christian young man.
Now, in this role play, done the correct way, you will see that the counselor did sit forward, the counselor looked directly at the client and gave the client his full attention. Another approach in listening is that of paraphrasing. Now, this simply means that as the person is talking, you can repeat what the person is saying in your own words. And this will help the counselee to recognize that you are in fact hearing what he's saying. You are in touch with what he's saying. Again, we'll have a brief demonstration of this with the role play.
I just can't seem to find any Christian young men in the church. And what is happening now is that I find myself compromising, going out with single men, but then they're not Christians.
So you're saying that you can't find any Christian men in the church,
No.
and you find yourself going out with single young men, and they are not Christians.
No.
So here you have the counselee saying something, and the counselor is saying, I am listening, and he's saying this by paraphrasing what the counselee just said. Now, another aspect of listening is clarifying. In order to be certain that you are with the person, from time to time you need to clarify what the person says, because sometimes you might be assuming that the person said something when in fact he's saying something else. So one can simply say to the person, just tell me, is it that you're talking about your father or your mother at this time? I'm not quite clear. So this is one way in which one can clarify what the counselee is saying. Do you want to tell me some more about your problem?
Well, it's just becoming very frustrating because here it is. I'm here praying that this guy would get saved. He has all of the good qualities. He's, I guess, what one may call the good guy, but in a sense. But of course, we have different interests. He likes going to the disco. As a Christian, you know, it's just not my way of life.
So if I can clarify for a minute, let me get this clear. You are going out with a particular fellow at the moment.
Yes, that's right.
So you're going steady with a particular fellow.
Well, I don't know if I want to call it steady, but we have been dating quite regularly.
You have been dating.
Right.
Now, another approach in counseling and in listening is what we call perception checking. And this involves your checking with the person that what the person is saying is what you perceive them to be saying. And this will be demonstrated in the role play coming up.
Dating quite
you
regularly.
have been dating.
Right,
All right,
right.
that's clearer to me. And if I can get this straight, now, I am perceiving that you have an interest in this fellow. You seem to have an interest that you want to get more involved. That's what I perceive. Is my perception correct? Is that the way I'm seeing it? Is that the way it is with you? That you have this interest in him?
Yes, I do have that interest, but you know, like I was saying, that we just look at life differently. Our priorities are different. What I may see as wrong, he sees nothing wrong with it. And you know, so there comes a clash.
In the role play that you just saw, the counselor tried to make certain that what he was perceiving about what the client said was in fact what the client said. At first, he did not perceive accurately, so he checked this out, and then he discovered that he wasn't. So then he was able to be sure then that his perception was correct. Now we move on to the second skill that is involved in counseling. We spoke about listening, and now another skill that is involved is what we call leading. Now, this again is important in gaining understanding. Not only must one allow the counselee to start talking, but one will have to guide the counselee so that he can talk more, and one can gain more and more information as part of the exploration. Now, there are two types of leading. First of all, there is indirect leading, and indirect leading involves taking an open approach where a person is then free to talk about anything that he wants to talk about. So for example, one may say to the client simply, tell me more about that. and then the client is able to speak in a general way. Secondly, we have direct leading. But before I speak about direct leading, I just want to give you another way of going about indirect leading. As well as saying, tell me more about that, one could simply say, yes, and nod. And this shows the client that you are with them, that you are listening, and it is a way of leading the client to continue talking simply by saying yes, and so on. Now let's come back to direct leading. Indirect leading, as I have said, involves an open-ended approach, allowing the client to talk about anything. Now at some stage, you may wish to get some more information in your exploration about a specific aspect of the counsellee's problem. And so here one uses direct leading. So one might say then, tell me more about your relationship with your wife. This is being more specific, so you can know more about that particular area, as you are sensing that this is where the problem is. Now, one can use another approach in terms of questioning as another type of leading, questioning. And we can have what we call open-ended questioning. And in open-ended questioning, like indirect leading, one is allowing the person to respond in a way where he can talk about anything in that particular area. So one could say, for example, how is your relationship on the job? That's a type of open-ended questioning. And what this means is that the person will start telling you about his relationship on the job. The opposite type of questioning is closed-ended questioning. And here, one can ask the question, are you getting on fine on the job? Now this type of questioning, closed-ended, is asking for a question, yes or no. It is best to avoid this type of questioning. Are you getting on well with your wife? The person might tend to feel, well, I don't want to divulge this, it's too embarrassing, it's too hurtful. So he'll say, I'm getting along fine. Yes, I'm getting along fine. So you see, when you ask these types of questions that demand a yes or no answer, you very often will allow the person to get away from facing up to his problems by saying no or yes, as the case may be. Now we're going to have another role play which is going to demonstrate two things. It is going to demonstrate indirect leading and direct leading and open-ended questioning and closed-ended questioning.
I'll tell you something. Before I was saved, when I went out with a guy, it usually lasted years. I've had very, very few boyfriends, so to speak. But now that I'm saved and I can't find a Christian guy, I find that, I would date one guy here for 1 or 2 months, and I realize that, I really shouldn't be dating this guy who is not saved. And I'd cool out for a little while, but then I'd move on and meet somebody else, and this need that I have of being with someone, I just find myself dating again. And well, the guy that I'm dating now, I've been dating him for some time, but I'm tired hopping around.
You want to tell me some more about that?
Well, it's just that we just see things a little differently, It's just that I guess our lifestyle's a little different, and I said to you before that my purpose in life is different now.
All right, you're talking about your purpose in life. Could you tell me more specifically about when it comes to the matter of, say, premarital sex, for example? Do you have any differences in that area?
Premarital sex, we discuss it all the time, usually comes up.
Tell me something, Miss Brown. You know, both of us are Christians and we're big people, and we need to face up to certain facts. Do both of you have intercourse?
No.
All right. Let me put it a more general way. Just tell me how both of you deal with the matter of relating together at the physical level.
Well, there are a lot of temptations, and I always try to keep in the forefront of my mind that greater is He that is within me. But sometimes I find that it's best that we go to dinner or, in places where there are other people, because if I go by his apartment, it proves to be more difficult, and we slip now and then.
Oh, you say you slip now and then? I see. So probably we need to talk about that a bit more. That could be a problem. Fine, you have just seen this role play, and you have seen the indirect leading approach, which helped the person to speak in a general way, and you saw how the person spoke in a general way, and a lot of information was coming out. Then you saw the direct leading, where the person said, tell me more about the specific area, and the person then was able to move into, the counselee was able to move into a specific area, which aided the exploration. Then, in the open-ended questioning, the counselee was able to talk about several different things when the counselor asked a question in an open type of way. But then you also saw where before the open-ended questioning, when the person asked a closed-ended question, then the person simply said, no, I'm having no problem in that area. And then one was not able to get very far. So you do see the difference in the leading and the aspects of the leading and the difference in the questioning. We have spoken about listening and the skills involved in listening. We have also spoken about leading and the skills involved. And another aspect in the whole process of counseling skills, another skill is that of eliciting feelings. Remember we spoke about ventilation as part of the exploration, in that particular step of exploration and ventilation, which aids understanding. And we said that bad feelings are poisonous. If bad feelings are kept in, then this can affect one's health and one's relationship and one's feeling of well-being. Therefore, it is useful to try to get the counselee to get out the anger, the hurt, the depression, the sense of hopelessness, the frustration, all these bad feelings, so that he or she can feel more relieved, less anxious, less depressed, and then be able to cope with the problem and cope with his or her relationships. Now, one point here about feelings. I believe that in our culture, in the West Indies, and perhaps in Western culture generally, in this hemisphere, that we have been brought up not to express our feelings. And because of this, I find that people who are involved in counseling or who are learning about counseling are sometimes afraid to deal with the feelings of the counselee. So that when somebody starts crying, someone might say, oh, don't worry to cry, don't bother to cry. Try to be strong. Even as children, when we are growing up and we run to our mothers and fathers, we begin to cry, hush up, don't cry. That's not good, especially with men, of course, little boys must not cry, men must not express their feelings. So I think we have to work against this in our counseling process, in the community, in the church, our clinics, etc. We must work against this tendency to keep feelings down. So then, how do we go about eliciting feelings? One thing that we can do, very simple and basic, is to question the person, questioning. For example, saying, how does that make you feel? How does that problem or that difficulty that you're having make you feel? Then the person will share the feeling. Besides questioning about feelings, another thing that we can do is try to sense the feeling that a person must be having as he or she is talking about a problem. And as you sense that feeling in terms of how the person is talking or what the person is talking about, the person's nonverbal expressions of sadness, frustration, as you sense these feelings in what the person is saying, nonverbal expressions, then you can identify for the person those feelings that you think he or she is having. Identify the feelings. For example, then you can say, it seems to me that you are feeling frustrated from what I'm hearing you saying. So then you identify the feeling and you reflect the feeling back to the person. From what I hear you saying, from looking at the expression on your face, it seems to me that you are frustrated. So you are identifying the feeling and reflecting it back to the person. And you'll then find that after you identify the feeling, reflect it back to the person is going to start expressing that feeling more and more, sometimes even to the point of tears. Now we'll have a role play trying to demonstrate the approaches we can use in questioning a person about their feelings and in identifying feelings.
You know, he's the only man since I have been saved that I've gone to bed with. And, you know, I try to leave him, but the loneliness, you know, just sets in. And you know, it's just so difficult to deal with it. And I find myself going back, and when I go back, I find myself giving in. And, you know, I just, you know, what am I supposed to do?
Tell me, how does that make you feel?
Dirty. Frustrated.
It makes you feel dirty, it makes you feel frustrated.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm saved. Be faithful, then he can be faithful. I don't believe in this business about men can go around and have as many as they want, but then I must stay home. You know, I never believed in that, and so it's you know, it has me really torn.
But it seems to me that you're feeling quite angry about the situation because of what he's doing to you.
Yeah, I try. I really, really try to stay really calm about it, but it's difficult. You know I shouldn't be getting angry in the first place. What am I doing in this relationship? You know, it's one of the first questions I ask myself. But I can't control that.
In the role play you just saw, the counselor, in trying to help the person to express their feelings, questioned the person about how she was feeling, and then she was able to share how she was feeling. Also, the counselor, in another stage, if we can imagine that this was another stage of the interview, said to the person, well, it seems to me that you are feeling so and so. And the counselee was then able to respond by elaborating on that feeling after the counselor identified the feeling and reflected it back to the counselee. Now let us talk further about the skills. So after eliciting feelings, we then go on to the aspect of reflecting. Now reflecting involves just what the word says, projecting back to the counselee the content of what the counselee is saying, as well as the feelings. It's like being a mirror. When you look in the mirror, you see how your face looks, if it's properly made up, or if your hair is properly combed, or if you're properly dressed. The mirror is telling you how you are dressed, how you appear. The mirror is reflecting. So in the same way, you, the counselor, can reflect to the person what they are saying and the feelings that they are expressing, verbally or non-verbally. So then, the technique to use in reflecting is simply to say to the person, for example, you have just said that you are having a difficult time with your boss on the job. You reflect this back, this is what the person has said. You can also reflect feelings. You have just said to me that you are feeling hurt and upset. Now what you will find is that as you reflect the content of what the person is saying and the feeling, the person comes to recognize that in fact you are hearing what they are saying. And this will then stimulate the person to talk further. He's hearing what I'm saying, I feel free, I can now talk further. And it's a very useful technique in getting someone to talk freely. Now another aspect of reflecting is to stress that what you are hearing is coming from that particular person, and that you are focusing in on what he is feeling and what he is saying. So it is important in your reflection to stress that you are saying that you are feeling upset because you are having a difficult time with your boss. So you're saying to the person, it is what you are saying and what you are feeling that is important. And this is very important because it is what the person is feeling. Perhaps the person could be feeling inappropriately, or what they are saying could be inappropriate, but the fact is that it is they who are feeling that way, whether you agree with what they are saying or whether you agree with how they are feeling, whether they should feel that way or not. But you are saying that you are feeling this way and that you have said to me that you are not getting on with your boss. Now, we'll have another role play illustrating the technique of reflecting both the content of what the person is saying and the feeling. And here you will see how the client was able to speak more freely.
All things are possible with God. But I can't even get him to go to church. The church that he attends, well, just doesn't teach being born again. And, well, he may go Christmas, some other special occasion. But it's really, really difficult to really, he came to church with me once, but it's really difficult to get him to come out to church because he believes that he is a good person. He doesn't hurt anybody, you know, the same thing that I suppose most of us went through before we, you know, saw the light. And it's almost like a dead end.
So you're saying that the church that he attends is that an evangelical church, it doesn't speak about being born again, and that for you, your feelings you have is that it's a dead-end situation. Those are your feelings.
Right. He looked at me the other day and said, "What's the difference? I'm living a good, moral life. I mean, what are you concerned about?" It's almost as though he is sure that, in a sense, that he doesn't have to do anything with his life right now in any case. He has a whole life ahead of him and he can just do what he wants until he gets ready. So it's kind of contradictory in a way, because he feels that once he gets older and is ready to settle down, then he would do what is right. But on the other hand, he's saying, well, he doesn't see the difference. And I really feel guilty because of that, because my testimony isn't much.
I see. So then, in the role play that you just saw, the counselor reflected both the content of what the counselee said and also the feelings that the counselee reported. And you saw the response where the counselee then felt free to speak more after this was done. Now, another skill that we have to be able to exercise, apart from reflecting, is that of confronting. Now, I know that this is something that many of us find difficult to do, but very often we find that as we relate to counselees, sometimes they find it difficult to talk about their problems, and they begin to stray and talk about different things, and if we are not careful, we find that we are getting all over the place and getting nowhere, and one has to then help the person to get back to the point. And also sometimes we find that the counselee may be saying things or in his life doing things or thinking things that are inappropriate, that are illogical, and that are inconsistent. Now we have to help the counselee come to terms with these things, and it means that we have to confront the person, and this requires some amount of bravery but also some amount of diplomacy and tact. Now, these behaviors of being illogical, inconsistent, unrealistic in terms of what one is thinking, saying, or doing in one's life or in the interview, and also trying to avoid talking about the problem, this does not help the person to deal with the problem. And you are there to help the person to help themselves to deal with the problem, so you have to then help them to deal with these behaviors. Now, there are various ways in which one can confront. First of all, one can ask the counselee to reflect on what he or she just said. They might have said something which was illogical or something which was inconsistent. We don't use the word lying, but we say inconsistent with what they said before, or something which is inappropriate. And one could say to the person, well, just repeat what you said a while ago. So let the person repeat, and let them examine the consistency. Repeat what you just said. Think about it for a while. Examine it. What do you think about what you just said? And very often the person will then be able to detect the inconsistency, the illogical nature, or the inappropriateness of what they said, or the comment they made on what they were doing, the aspect of their lives and behavior that they were reporting. Another way in which one can confront is to give one's own opinion, But here, in giving your opinion, you're not going to say, I think that you are being inappropriate, you are being inconsistent or illogical, or you're avoiding the issue. One can give one's opinion in a question form. Do you think, rather than saying, I think that so-and-so, which can appear judgmental, one can say, do you think that you have been avoiding discussing the real problem? Perhaps it's difficult for you. Is that what you think? Very often the person will then think and say, in fact, yes. Or do you think that what you told me a while ago, just think back, did you say something else before? The person will then think and then say, yes, you know, I said something different. Then the person will try to make it consistent rather than saying, you know, I think you're not telling the truth. You use a question form in confronting. Or one could say, do you think that what you did in relation to this problem with your boss or your wife, how appropriate do you think it was? Again, you're asking, the person will reflect and perhaps admit that it was not appropriate, rather than saying, I believe that that was inappropriate. So one is using a question form in one's confrontation, which can be a very useful approach. One needs to recognize in one's confronting, by reflecting and asking the person to examine, or by questioning, one needs to recognize that most counsellees, despite the illogical, inconsistent, inappropriate ways they behave, and despite not wanting sometimes to discuss the problem openly, that basically they do have a desire to behave appropriately. And one has to recognize this and not be judgmental in one's confrontation. We're now going to have another role play demonstrating the types of approaches we can use in this skill of confronting.
I don't know what the problem is these days with these men. You know, I just travel all around the world, and everywhere I go, it seems as though there is a problem with relationships because the man feels the need. I don't know what it is that he feels, but he goes out and he feels that he must have relationships with other women. And I have a friend, you know, who is going through the same kind of turmoil right now. Same thing. Out all the time.
Hold a second now. Could you just reflect on what you're doing right now and examine how appropriate it is?
Well, I guess avoiding the issue a little bit, huh? It's not really the point. I guess we really need to deal with what the problem is. That's my problem.
Yes,
dealing with the problem.
So you really say that you're avoiding the issue and that you really need to deal with the problem.
I guess when it really boils down to it, it's not bad at all going with an unsafe guy, you know. As long as he has his head on right, and it's a fairly moral guy, you know. I guess I really don't see anything wrong with it.
Hold a minute. Earlier on you were saying that it was a problem for you because you were a Christian and you were involved with a fellow who was a non-Christian, and you weren't happy about that. It was a problem. And now you're saying it's not a problem after all. Do you think that there is some inconsistency between what you are saying now and what you were saying before? Do you think there's some difference? What's happening?
Well, not really, you know, because I think I did say that he was okay, you know. He was kind of on the righteous side. And when you really look at it, any relationship that you have with anybody, there are going to be problems. So, I don't know. You know, I think I'm avoiding the issue again, right? Yeah. Okay. I would like to, I guess if I had it my way, then I would settle for the next best thing. But that's not the point. He's not saved.
All right, so you're saying that there is in fact some inconsistency, and you're going back to what you're saying, that the fact that he's not saved, that's really a problem for you.
Yes, it is a problem.
So there in that role play, you saw the counselor dealing with a situation where the counselee was avoiding discussing her problem, and he was then able to face her with this issue by asking her to reflect on what she just did and to examine it, and then she was able to admit that she was avoiding the issue. Then we also see, if you imagine that the other section was another time in the interview, we also see that the counselee was saying something which was inconsistent with what she said earlier, and the counselor was able then to give an opinion, but in a question form, asking the person whether or not what she said fitted in what she said earlier, and then she was able to think about it and to admit, and then one was able to get a more coherent and consistent account of what took place, so that the counselee would be able to then come to terms with the problem rather than avoiding it. And also we saw where there was some behavior which was inappropriate in what the counselee was expressing in his or her situation, and the counselor was able to, again in question form, ask the person about that, and she was able to admit this, and then that would help to clarify the situation so that the person could then deal with the problem. The graphic, which you will now see, presents a summary of the various skills involved in the process of counseling. You'll remember that these skills enable the counselor to explore the problem effectively and to enable the client to ventilate, and this enables understanding. There are certain other skills that we need to mention, which was mentioned in the presentation dealing with the steps. These skills are, firstly, interpretation, and secondly, planning for action. If you will remember, and if you look back at your handouts, if you have handouts, you can then refresh your mind as to what these skills involved. There are steps, as they were described as steps, but there are also skills in themselves. So look again at the graphic of these skills, remember the others, and I hope that as you proceed in your counseling, you will now try to practice these skills over and over until you feel that they are a part of your counseling technique.